we just finished talking about the patrol function of law enforcement, its role and purpose, and how does patrolling deter crime. It deters crime through proactive policing, along with making arrests, using advancements in technology, and focusing on peacekeeping or the community order and safety. And we noted that with regards to rapid responding, that doesn't always help because primarily the reporting time of the crime has to be, it's kind of instantaneous. You have to find the perpetrator actually committing the crime, and any time thereafter, it makes it harder to apprehend somebody. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the investigation function of law enforcement, which is where we are off to now. And as we discussed, television and movie portrayals of law enforcement are far from accurate. Generally, law enforcement, they are trained and they are experienced in a wide range of techniques, including investigative techniques. They know and are trained in legal principles of criminal procedure and criminal laws. We're going to expand more on that in Chapter 6. And they are even aware of the laws and rules of evidence, and that means what needs to happen in order to get somebody or some case in front of a court or a jury, and what types of information will be allowed in a court. So they have to be knowledgeable in those areas. In the event they make an arrest, a case has to be proven, and it's proven with evidence. We already talked about the organization of the investigative services within a police department. You move up through the ranks to achieve a position, and then you get there, and then you move up again. You can go back to the flow chart for that review. So, how do investigators or detectives, and that name is used interchangeably, the city of Plattsburgh, and I think most cities refer to their detectives as detectives, and then our New York State troopers refer to those who do the investigative function as investigators. So that, I might use that word interchangeably, it means the same, investigators, detectives. There's a number of ways they get involved. Could be a call from patrol who made an initial contact. That generally happens all the time. For instance, one person sticks out in my mind that I represented. He was charged with possession of counterfeit money. He was using the money at a gas station here in Clinton County, and the clerk, who they have the little fancy pens when they scratch off on big bills, and she caught it, and she called the police while the individual was there. And the individual had to remain there because she had his ID in her possession. She wouldn't give it back. So calls the police, and patrol comes, and then patrol takes a look at, oh, okay, we got something happening here. So they call a detective, who then comes in and interviews the clerk, asks to talk to the individual, and looks at the money, and basically this would be something considered a very quick investigation, and then determines what the next step is, and then patrol would make the arrest based on the detective's investigation. So a call from patrol. They can decide to do something on their own. They might be looking into an old cold case, or they might get a tip that a house, that illegal activity is going on. For instance, that a particular house is a place where people go in and buy drugs in and out. They can go undercover. Some infiltrate like gangs to learn how gangs work, or the mafia, but they can go undercover. They can also pretend to be a potential victim, i.e. they pose as someone. And I should note here before I move on is that sometimes they're just assigned to a specific type of crime. Like they're only going to investigate gun control or drugs or burglaries, or they might be assigned to a specific area. If we're talking about a big location, they might be assigned to a specific geographic area. So there are 3 prongs to this investigation approach. Kind of go through those. Specific focus. So they begin with, under the specific focus, they begin collecting info right at the scene. Let's say there was a big fire at a house. The fire folks come and they put it out, and they realize that the cause of this fire was a homemade meth lab gone bad. So the police investigator comes out. They start collecting the remnants of the lab. There might be some batteries and some soda bottles and some empty cold medicine packets. These are all like items that folks need to make meth, and maybe there's some Coleman fuel bottles. So they start collecting up this evidence, that specific focus. Then the next approach is general coverage. So they go from specific crime scene to general, where they begin to interview the people maybe in the neighborhood. Maybe there was somebody the homeowner, trying to find out, was the place empty? Or maybe they don't know who owns it, so they talk to the neighbors. Did you see anything? And they walk around the outside. Maybe there's some other evidence going on. Check out the trash, see what was thrown away in the trash, and they move out. And then there's the informative step, where they use technology, where they gather documents or records. It could be cell phone records. It could be what's on the computer. Maybe they found a computer, so they take the drive. They look into the background of a person who might be of interest, i.e. in my example could be the homeowner. So they might have to go out and search for the deed to find out who owns the place. Or maybe if the place was rented out, they find the owner, which could then lead to the tenant. So this is like an expansive approach, right? You go in, you got the scene, and then you expand, and then you have to do get some more background information. Another example, there's a series of neighborhood burglaries, let's say. What might they have to do? Let's go through the steps. They visit the house, right? They get a call, and they visit the house. What's taken from the house? They might do some forensics. We'll get into more forensics in a little bit. They look for fingerprints. Maybe there's some footprints. It rained the day before, and they can see footprints that go around the house up to the window that looks like somebody shimmied it open or used a tool to get in. They look for anything out of place. They start interviewing residents, and if this was a neighborhood hit of burglaries, they're checking out each home, talking to the homeowner. They may walk through the neighborhood and look for discarded items from the homes, look for any sort of pathway that the perpetrator may have taken, figure out if anyone in the neighborhood whose house wasn't hit, who may be a possible scene or why wasn't it hit, and they'll use this information, collect some names, and then do the next step. They might be looking for someone who's a recent parolee in the neighborhood, and if that recent parolee's former crime was burglary, going to be a person of interest. So, and as you know, if you're at the level of being an investigator or detective, you already have a bit of experience. You were a patrol before that. You're not you might be a new investigator, but you're certainly not brand new to law enforcement. So you use some of that experience, and you tie these approaches together. And the point is, the law enforcement creates the quote-unquote story of how a crime took place. course, this happened, that happened, and it's nice to see on television when they do it in a nice little hour-long TV show, the steps that happen along the way. So, my next question. The more serious the crime, the more likely it is that detectives will solve it. What do you think? True or false? That is a true statement. The more serious, the more time and attention that is given. So therefore, the rate of solving it is higher. Also, the more serious could lead to a more, I want to talk about the media a little later, but if it's a murder case, then there's a whole other level of stress that comes with solving the problem. We'll come back to that because I want to give you another example about serious crime. So, are there any unintended side effects of concentrating resources on just the serious crimes? Is it at the expense of the less serious crimes? Or are the serious crimes solved for other reasons than just priority? We're going to solve the more serious crimes first. I'm going to give you an example of serious crimes in New York State. Burglary in the second degree. Sounds pretty serious. Burglary in the second, I'm just going to very general. Burglary in the second degree involves breaking and entering into someone's home. Okay? And that's considered a Class C felony. We talked about our misdemeanors and our violations and our felonies. Felony is the highest level crime, and in New York they're ranked in classes. A being the highest, worst, and E being the lowest. So this is a C. This is in the center. Criminal possession of a controlled substance. And a controlled substance, for example, would be something like cocaine or heroin. Criminal possession of a controlled substance in the third degree is a Class B felony. Assault in the first degree, that is in New York State, is causing some serious injury to another using a weapon. Okay, so hitting somebody with a bat would get you an assault in the first degree charge, and that is a Class C felony. Now, based on what I said, which one of those is the most serious? The controlled substance. Criminal possession of a controlled substance. But does that involve anybody? We have a burglary. We got a victim. Somebody's home was entered into. Things were taken. Or some crime was committed therein. With an assault, somebody's getting a serious injury by the use of somebody using a weapon. I would think, well, does that sound pretty serious? Yeah, they're all serious crimes. But the most serious is criminal possession of a controlled substance. And who's our victim? Society. There's not a face with that. So if detectives are focusing on the more serious crimes, in this instance, who's losing out? Victims, right? You feel like nothing's being done for them if they're focusing on something that's considered serious, which in my example is the drugs. Getting the drugs off the street is that's helpful. I mean, so these are the things, we got to think about when they're investigating. Sure, we want to investigate serious crimes, but we also don't want to take away from victims of lesser offenses. And with these more serious crimes, we see focused groups amongst law enforcement, like the Adirondack Drug Task Force that I keep mentioning. They focus on these drug cases to keep them out of, the drugs out of society. Another reason, and I alluded to this already, is a crime that's reported while it's happening. The police have a better chance of catching the person. But as time elapses, the chances of police catching the person starts to decline. And as a result of that, conviction rates drop. Sometimes what else happens? The evidence is gone. They take it with them. They get rid of it. They destroy it. Most burg cases get dropped rather quickly. The stuff, that's the point of taking stuff, is to then sell it and make money, not to keep it. So I'd note that most crimes get solved when the perpetrator is identified at the crime scene. So that's when most of them get solved, but that's not, I mean, certainly they get solved afterwards, after investigation, but time is critical. So the more time that goes by, the more difficulty it is. Sting operations. These are fun, right? We all heard that phrase before, sting operations, where undercover police, they pose as criminals. They want to trap violators. They might use different squads to do that. They do have, groups that focus on, things like child pornography and prostitution. There is a fine line between law enforcement and criminal activity. I think we discussed that with actually, I don't know if we discussed that yet. Entrapment. If we have not, we will discuss that in our criminal section, courts section. That fine line with regards to entrapment. Or maybe we'll have to throw it in when we're talking about laws and criminal procedure in Chapter 6, because there is that fine line. But sting, one of my favorite sting operations that I hope you're all going to be familiar of, that TV show, To Catch a Predator. NBC had that show out, and it actually wasn't law enforcement that was behind all that. Certainly law enforcement was makes the arrest in the end, but a legal group called Legal Justice, I think it was called. They worked with NBC. Chris Hansen was the individual, the host of To Catch a Predator, and basically they set up online, they put the group poses as young individuals, usually women, and they seek to flush out child predators. And after exchanging some emails, there's a come meet me one night and here's my address, bring flowers and alcohol or whatever is asked to bring, and then when the individual shows up, who comes out but Chris Hansen, and kind of starts to interview them. And after that, as soon as the person goes to leave, he's like, "You're free to leave. I'm out." He's like, "I'm out of here." So leaves, and then what happens? He's arrested, right? And it's most of the time it's men. I don't think I've seen a woman on the show, but I don't watch. I didn't watch it regularly, as you may know. It's not on anymore because there has been several lawsuits as a result of that. Some individuals, unfortunately, who were involved or who got caught up in the sting were pretty prominent people, and at least 2 people committed suicide as a result. And then there was lawsuits brought, and NBC shut it down. But again, we'll talk about media's role, but that is a form of a sting operation. It made it public, and it was on TV. The question was that, is that ethical? I mean, and it wasn't. Law enforcement just made the arrest in the end. But if you've seen the show, when they make the arrest in the end, it's a big to-do. It's like a SWAT team, and there's 6 or 7 law enforcement. They grab the person, throw them on the ground, and kind of manhandle them a little bit. Like, that's all for TV and for show. That's not really how somebody gets arrested generally, or how the procedure works generally. But anyhow, it was an example that I was hoping that we'll connect. Oh yeah, I saw that show, and that's what we're talking about, sting operations. Another approach to investigation, organized groups of detectives and patrol officers who deceive criminals into openly committing illegal acts and conspiring to engage in criminal acts. Remember, I just talked about that. the fine line between entrapment and opportunity. Basically what they do is they give criminals an opportunity, and that's what happened also in To Catch a Predator. They were just giving the person the opportunity. And is that effective? You know, law enforcement, they pose as an underage woman looking for an older man for company. Those are typical ads on Craigslist, by the way, and there's some sting operations locally relative to those. Do you find anything deceptive with that? The undercover law enforcement who poses as a prostitute in hopes of, you know, catching a John, as they call them. So those things to think about, but they do create sting operations, and as of recently in this area, they seem to be focused on drugs and child pornography, or child predators, I should say. How about investigation? I'm sorry, technology and investigation. Does it improve investigation, technology? There's lots of technology available for investigators. I'm going to leave this evaluating. I'm just going to switch gears to my evaluating investigation, what's on the screen right now. I've kind of tied these in to what we've already talked about. I'll let you read that slide on your own if you're flipping through the printout versions, but I've touched on some of these already, and I'm going to touch on them after the technology, but I want to talk about technology. Does it improve investigation? We did discuss some technologies in Chapter 4 that help crime investigation. As you can imagine, communications, criminal identification, you know, where you can get criminal histories and background on a specific individual or individuals, and you can get this now country and worldwide. There's a computer program, CopLink, that gives them all these sources to get background information fairly quickly. I think the CopLink is actually in the cars. There's better ways of storing the information. The internet has, as you know, cloud services where information can get stored. Law enforcement can communicate extremely fast. I mean, they all have cell phones. They all, not just the CB radios, they could text each other fairly quickly. There's texting apps just among the various law enforcement agencies. They can put GPS tracking on a vehicle. They need a warrant, but they can put GPS tracker on a vehicle and then sit back and watch the program of where the vehicle is going. They usually use that in monitoring drug trafficking. They have DNA databanks, fingerprint databanks. Most common one that's been around a very long time is fingerprint. If you're convicted of a crime, your fingerprint stays in a database. And if another crime has committed where fingerprints were pulled, they run the database. They run the check of the new fingerprint found and run a database to see if there's a match. And if there's a match, then the person becomes obviously a person of interest because now they're at the scene of this other crime. So DNA, with the improvements of technology, the state of New York became one of the first states to implement, in 2006, DNA sampling for persons convicted of, at this time, in 2006, a limited number of felonies and a few misdemeanors. It works the same way. If you were convicted of the named felonies and the named misdemeanors, you would have to provide, as part of your sentence, you provide a DNA sample that would go into a data bank, just like fingerprinting. And if there was a crime and DNA was found, they run it through the database, and someone would be flagged if there was a match. And when New York implemented this DNA requirement, it worked. There was it was a child predator, I believe, is what had happened. And this person, they were trying to solve this older case. They started collecting, per the law, they started collecting DNA. Sure enough, they were investigating another case, and I believe a child predator case, a sexual assault on a child, I'm pretty sure was the case. And when they ran the DNA, an individual was flagged, and sure enough, per the rest of the investigation, wasn't just based on the DNA, but per that, the individual was identified as the perpetrator and was arrested. So on the heels of that, in 2012, the governor and legislators of New York said every single felony and every single misdemeanor, when there's a conviction, will require a DNA sample to be taken and stored in the database. So in New York, if you're convicted of a crime, you have to provide a DNA sample for the database. Is that effective? I just gave you an example of its use. So it's another tool for investigators. With the technology advances, now there's DNA profiling. And there are tons more. The book doesn't hit them all. We're not going to hit them all. These are the big ones. We're going to shift to forensics. What is forensic? And it's the type of technology. What is forensic science? You guys watch another show, CSI, right? CSI television. There isn't a CSI lab here in Plattsburgh. The closest one is in Albany, New York State's lab. It's the use of, so forensic science is the use of scientific techniques to investigate and questions of interest to the justice system and to solve crimes. All right, it's so broad. A whole lot of things can fit under this forensic science. Blood, right? Testing blood, testing handwriting, drugs, alcohol. There's other bodily tissues and fluids that can be tested. Not just testing the blood. Whose blood is this? We're talking about like blood splatter and how the blood splattered. This is how the crime of murder was committed. They test paint, they test soil, there's glass testing, there's footprints, there's hair samples that get tested, bullets, ballistics, whether a bullet was shot from a particular gun, there's reconstruction of a crime scene. There's a whole bunch of items that fall under this forensic science. And these folks who do this kind of work, they testify in court. Some are just general criminologists, and others they deem themselves experts. Do you see any problem with this? This might be a great paper topic. I think it might even be one of the topics. Problem with this is juries like to follow the science. Do you see any ethical issues? Could be bias. Who are they working for? Are they working for the state? They get paid big bucks by the defense to come in and say their opinion. If you work for the crime lab of the state, you're always testifying for the state. There was a woman who was a crime lab technician in Massachusetts for, like 20 years, 10, 20 years. And a couple years ago, she was convicted of falsifying lab tests. Over 21,000 convictions were tossed out in the state of Massachusetts because she was a state drug analyst. She forged tests, she falsified tests, and she testified in court on her findings over the course of almost 10 years. problems with that. There's a whole bunch of problems with forensic science. It contributes to many wrongful convictions. Nearly half of DNA, 45% of DNA exoneration cases, and 1/4 of all exonerations in the United States is because of forensics. Through the Innocence Project, I got a link to their website on this issue. If you're going to write on this topic, it should be interesting, or you might be interested in reading about it a little further. Through the examination of more than 360 DNA exonerations, the Innocence Project has seen many examples of problems with forensic science. Let's talk about them real quick. Unreliable or invalid forensic discipline. You can't make yourself a expert by claiming to be an expert, which a lot of folks did early on without any real training. They would do some online classes or get some sort of certificate in one discipline or another. They used insufficient validation for some sort of methodology for validating their results, like analysts of shoe prints as a basis of identifying the unique source of the print is an example of a method that has not been sufficiently validated. So if you're analyzing like a shoe print as a basis of, identifying that defendant's unique source of the print is the source of the print, that hasn't been validated anywhere. They also give misleading testimony. They can exaggerate the significance of similarities between evidence of a crime scene and the evidence of the individual. It fails to include information on the limitations of the methods used. So the method's error rate is higher. There's obviously some, like everybody else, these folks who do this are human. So, samples can get mixed up. They can get contaminated, even if you're in a developed area that's validated by accurate fields of study. And in some cases, like the example I just gave you, some analysis fabricate results, or they hide exculpatory evidence, like favorable evidence to the defendant. So there's a lot of issues, and this is an area that's going through reform. And some of the, serious problems that need to be identified. And this is something that the Innocence Project is working on. This is especially related to death penalty cases. In 2020 alone, in the last several months, 3 people were exonerated out of death row in a few states. I think mostly, actually, I think all 3 of them came out of Alabama. Nonetheless, some of the things that they're trying to do as part of reform is to set national standards for forensics and measurement, using measurement expertise, and how they go about evaluating, setting national standards, increasing funding in those areas, and judicial training, meaning like judicial training in the admissibility of this information in a court and how it could be prejudicial and how you need it to actually be reliable. So judicial training in that area. So my final question before we move on: does the media help with investigations? Does the media help? They tend to like to talk about crimes a lot. If it bleeds, it leads. We talked about how it influences crime for sure, or the people's perception of crime. But what about TV shows like Unsolved Mysteries? Do they help? Flashing photos of those people, there's warrants against them on the TV screen during the news. Facebook, social media, can you help us find this individual, this person of interest? How about finding these victims if we're dealing with a kidnapping case? Surveillance videos, not necessarily the media, but it's nice to, you know, there's grocery stores that have cameras. They use it to protect their own area, but sometimes they catch a crime. Something happens on those cameras. Law enforcement, what else do they do? Sometimes they get right on TV and hold a press conference, help us find. We want to get the community involved. We need to capture this particular individual. Right? So that's the investigation function. We're going to move on to the next function in line, and that will also include a review of the criminal laws and criminal procedures.